moderating for us will be Marlene Motyka. She is with Deloitte and is the U.S. lead for alternative energy. She's got a great panel she's put together here. So with that, Marlene, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you, thank you. Thanks everybody for joining us. So what I'm gonna do is just introduce our panelists. First, I'll briefly talk about the goal here of the panel. I have some questions for them, but obviously we're gonna leave time for audience questions. So please feel free to raise your hand and be able to ask our esteemed panelists some questions. So Jay Zoellner is to my immediate right, and he is the Managing Director for Industrial Solutions at EnerNOC. So happy to have Jay here. Then we have Mike Whitlatch, VP Global Energy and Procurement at UPS. After that, we have Zach Shelin, Senior Analyst, the Cadmus Group, working on behalf of EPA's Energy Star program. And finally, we have Carlos Pacheco. Yeah. Did I get that right? Global Energy Manager for Coca-Cola. So thank you all for joining us today. So I think as we've kind of talked about over the day, and certainly in the last session I was in, that energy markets are volatile, they're changing and they're evolving, and they're very different in terms of where you may be located, either in the US or overseas. And so in some cases it's difficult to predict how they're going to develop, what the energy mix will look like in the future. And so as an organization, how do you protect yourself against some of the risks, the changing regulation, and changing stakeholder expectations? So our panel is going to discuss how companies and organizations are preparing, for, changes in energy costs. Certainly energy costs don't go down, they only tend to go up, and the level they go up depends upon a number of factors. And you want to make sure you're reducing your operational risk, that you're diversifying your energy sources, and how you can do all that while you're trying to cut your energy consumption and carbon emissions. So I'm going to start off with my first question to Mike. What are some ways an organization can use data to protect itself against potential energy risks and price spikes?
Well, I mean, at UPS, the first thing we kind of embarked on was getting a total understanding of our total exposure to energy across the entire portfolio, and it manifests itself in a variety of ways. I mean, obviously, for being a transportation company, exposure to fuels is obviously 91% of our emissions profile. So understanding direct is usually the easiest thing. That's the obvious when you go through and understand your direct. But what we really found out when you started going through it was there's lots of indirect energy exposure. So we really have started both helping other customers understand what their indirect energy costs are associated with the organization. A good example for even, let's just say UPS, would be we have a large exposure to purchase transportation. So that's rail, that's third-party carriers. And with that comes a host of potential accessorials and even fuel surcharges. So when you start looking at a company's exposure to these other indirect forms of energy, your direct energy book, which is your physical book, actually you have many gallon equivalents or BTU equivalents that are actually indirect. So when we sit down with other companies and help them go through this, they're really surprised to see what that indirect exposure is. But you can't get there unless you have data. And so for us, data, all forms of consumption data, purchase data, being able to aggregate that data and understand this is very key for understanding that exposure. Once you understand the exposure, then you can obviously manage the risk. That's
looking at third-party suppliers and vendors, because that all falls under your umbrella.
Sure.
Yeah, great. Does anybody else want to kind of add in anything on that? No? Okay, great. So, there's much more about the U.S. kind of shifting to renewable energy, and it's become a more popular topic. Even on the political arena, Hillary Clinton said that she would aim to get 33% of the U.S. electricity supply from renewable sources by 2027 if she was elected. You hear more and more about companies saying they want to have 100% of their supply from renewable energy. Lego announced that a few weeks ago, that by 2020 they want to be 100% renewable, and there's many other companies out there. I saw a statistic that actually said that 2/3 of Fortune 100 companies and nearly half of Fortune 500 companies have made renewable energy commitments. So if we think about where we are today and where many companies want to go, and maybe where the U.S. may be going, there could be some hurdles that companies face when they're shifting to that form of generation from non-renewables to renewables. So Carlos, do you maybe want to kind of weigh in on that and give your perspective?
Yeah, sure. And you're right. For Coca-Cola, renewable energy is very, very important. Even though we do not have an explicit renewable energy target, we do have a carbon value chain commitment. So it means we do not only look at our manufacturing sites, but across the value chain, from the ingredients all the way to the distribution and the refrigeration of our beverages. And to deliver on that public commitment, we want to drive renewable energy. And in that process, what we have seen with our bottling community is that there are obstacles that they face in order to engage in renewable energy, and those obstacles, they're going to depend on many things. It will depend on things like where the sites are located, what's the capabilities in those sites, what about legislation, and so on. So, but I would say, and we have run those exercises of us actually going there and asking to our field what would it take for them to implement more renewable energy projects. And one of the things that typically comes up is, if the capital investment is important, especially for the medium to small size bottlers, but we found that there are other significant and sometimes even more significant obstacles than the investment, and that's the lack of information and understanding on a number of things associated with renewable energy, being understanding the availability of the renewable resources in one area, the technologies, what are the advantages of disadvantages, what are the incentives there, and so on and so on. So the complexity around renewable energy is so much that it actually involves a lot of human resources from different parts. So that's an important challenge. And also, I think was mentioned in the previous panel, the other thing is, well, for those bottlers that choose maybe the path to have third-party investment and do power purchase agreements, then again, all those things that I mentioned, they come into play, and there are significant obstacles that need to be overcome, but also the value of sustainability. So in many of our locations, bottlers, they just continue to assess all these projects on the basis of simple economic payback. And then it's when we need to look at other non-tangible benefits, and it's a challenge to measure,
pull that all together, to measure
that part of
right.
sustainability.
Interesting.
Yeah.
How do you go? I'm just curious then, how do you go to try to measure that factor?
Yeah, we have done some, I would say, like pilot projects, and we have things which we call like the value creation model, and have different dimensions. It has social dimension, sustainability dimension, and it's all based on kind of examples and activities, and trying to put some numbers into those intangibles from sustainability. But it always is going to vary from place to place. It depends. I mean, what is valuable in one place is not the same in the other. So it's a continuous challenge.
Right. And what competing priorities are there?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Excellent. So, Zach, over 400,000 commercial buildings today are actively measuring and tracking their energy consumption using Energy Star Portfolio Manager, which I'm sure you're happy about.
That's right.
What do you think the most useful aspects of the tool are, and would you view getting data into the tool as one of the biggest barriers? Or what is the biggest barrier for future growth?
So for part one, I would say the two most useful aspects of the tool are comparison and data mobility. So as far as comparison, you can use Portfolio Manager to compare your buildings and your building's performance to each other, which is really useful in terms of setting priorities for your staff attention, for your investment budget, and also a big motivator internally if you have an underperforming facility, for sure. So that's one. And then you can go beyond that with Portfolio Manager using the data, the survey data that's on the back end to compare those buildings to similar type buildings across the country. So that gives you a broader perspective on your performance than you would see just by looking at buildings internally. And it also gives you some more motivation for improvement because you can see how much room you have to improve relative to buildings of that type across the country. And so that's even more of an added incentive to drive improvement as well. So access to that type of comparison is key. And then the second part of that is data mobility. So within Portfolio Manager, you have a sharing aspect of the tool. So you can have, let's say, 1,500 buildings in Portfolio Manager, and each of those buildings has 5 years of utility data for 3 different fuel types. You can share all of those buildings and all that data with another account holder with one click, basically. It's very easy for you to share that data with other account holders in bulk. And then you can also download reports and set metrics that are most important to you to measure the performance of those buildings, and very easily share those reports and share that distilled performance data with other account holders in Portfolio Manager, or just export that data to another platform altogether. So having that comparison and having that ability to get the data to the people who need it is extremely important. And as far as taking a step back and getting the data into the tool, I think that entry of the data into the tool itself is perceived as a barrier more so than it actually is. So people think that it's really intimidating to get 5,000 buildings into the tool, and sometimes they just don't even bother. Well, so we had, for an example, the post office came to us and they said, we've got 4,500 buildings. The federal government says we have to benchmark them. What do? We have this giant data dump into an Excel spreadsheet. It has nothing to do with the format of how you get data into Portfolio Manager. What do? Well, within a couple days, our technical support team was able to help them out with a couple of macros, and now all their data is in Portfolio Manager. And so now they're able to use those comparative metrics to set priorities, to do audits, and to implement improvements. So I think the bigger barrier beyond just getting the data into the tool is getting access to the data, period. It's that first step of getting the data internally for places that don't have a standardized data collection mechanism or whose data isn't centralized. I think that can be the biggest barrier to even getting started with the tool.
And I assume you would suggest that they shouldn't wait till they have all the data, right? Just work with the data you have, and then you can continue to populate it as needed.
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason to wait till you have 5,000 buildings. If you've got 1,000 ready to go, you can start taking advantage of those tools now. Yeah.
So you gave an example of the post office with 4,500 buildings. Can you talk about kind of other types of industries or businesses that have gotten a lot of benefit from the tool?
Yeah, so Kroger grocery store chain is one of my go-to examples because they have every barrier possible. They are in a low profit margin industry. They manage stores under a variety of different brands across the country, across hundreds of utility territories, and they are dependent on a lot of store managers who are not necessarily experts in energy use. So they've got all of those things standing between them and effective energy management. But what they decided to do is to use Portfolio Manager, using the data that they have, using their energy management team to prioritize that benchmarking. And it was a huge motivator because initially their engineering team said, we're pretty great. We do a good job. We've got all the low-hanging fruit. I think we've won all of the easy battles there are to fight with energy management. I think we've arrived. Congratulations, guys. Well, then they entered their data into Portfolio Manager and they got a bunch of 60s on the Energy Star score, which is 1 to 100. That's it. And so that really gave them an incentive to push to improve that score because they realized even if we have Energy Star 1 to 100 scores of 80 that are ranked between supermarkets across the country, there's still room left for us to improve. And so they're able to use those competitive dynamics and those comparative metrics to drive improvements to where now they have about 600 stores that are in the top quartile of energy efficiency for supermarkets across the country. And they've been really successful in showing where the opportunities for improvement are and also in using the tool to document their success so they continue to get management buy-in on this improvement process. And so I think they're a really good example of how that can work. And another good example is USAA Real Estate. So they benchmarked all their office spaces in Portfolio Manager. Got about 95% of them now that are ENERGY STAR certified for top efficiency. And they've also used competitive dynamics in their organization. And they're able to do that because they had that data, because they had those benchmarks in Portfolio Manager. So we've got a lot of companies across the spectrum, public sector, private sector, that are able to find value.
Great, thank you. So Jay, I understand you're a blogger.
A little bit.
A little bit. So I think in one of your recent blog posts, you said software that relates energy use to energy cost as a function of incremental time at an individual location is a key requirement, but is rare. So what do you think is holding companies back from understanding their cost profile as a function of time and location?
Yeah, I think the key thing is, I mean, there's 90,000 tariffs out there in the
Really?
US,
Only?
right? Yeah, only that, right.
And I have some European clients who come over and say, just tell me what happens in the US market. And I'm like, what state? They said, what do you mean what state?
exactly
They say
right.
it's the US, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the key challenges. So, you know, if you can get an understanding of what it's costing you to use your energy when you're using it, so those two elements together, I think a lot of decisions would be made differently in terms of how companies manage their energy and reduce their energy spend. So, you know, that challenge is very difficult to realize. And, you know, I think that's one of the key things that we need to do.
And so do you find that though companies are becoming more sophisticated and more willing to understand various programs they can utilize from maybe their utility provider in order to, you know, kind of optimize the system or the pricing?
So I think a lot of the customers will use a blended rate, and so that helps. And certainly with the increase in availability of information and data, that putting those two together helps. But there's a significant element of how much it's costing you and when you're using it that I think is missing in pretty rare in today's business. So
they really just don't have like that enough detail to really optimize.
Right. And I think it if you do that, you'll be able to unlock, you know, a lot of the detail. And, you know, we work with companies like Urginet who can help provide that information. And I think that's something that's a significant opportunity for companies.
Any questions from the audience yet, or no? Okay. Well, no. You can take a rest for a while again. All right, but hopefully you guys will come up with questions. So, question here for another one for Zach. According to the Institute of Market Transformation, 14 cities and 2 states have already adopted energy benchmarking and transparency laws. So how are these, you know, requirements transforming the way organizations within these jurisdictions track and manage energy, and what are the challenges then too they're running into?
So as of about 6 months ago, we had 50,000 properties that were in either cities or counties that were subject to these benchmarking disclosure requirements. They have to benchmark their buildings in Portfolio Manager, release that data to the city, and in some cases publicly on an annual basis. And that scale has been blown up by this new assembly bill that just passed in California, which has now extended a requirement like that across the entire state. And so it's important to note that the reason that those particular localities chose Portfolio Manager is because the tool was already an industry standard for benchmarking energy performance. And so I think the biggest change that that's producing is related to an example that you see in California, where because of the passage of Assembly Bill 802, you now for the first time have building owners who are able to get energy data, whole building, for their own buildings from their utilities in an electronic format that they can use to benchmark. I'm not making that up. They couldn't do that before in all cases. So I think that creating that data transparency is one of the biggest trends that's born out of these benchmarking disclosure requirements, because people need the data. They have an ironclad reason why they need the data. They have to comply. They get fined if they don't. And so because they need the data, necessity is the mother of invention, and they're getting data available to them from different utilities in different formats. Obviously, Urginet has been hugely integral to that, and making sure that they have what they need to comply with the regulation. And I would say that's especially relevant here in Atlanta, where they have a disclosure requirement now on the books, but there needs to be some help and some gap filling there on making sure that building owners who are required to do this have the data they need to do it. So solving that barrier that I mentioned on getting the data is one of the big trends here.
And when you look at those cities and states, I mean, I mean, who's required to comply? I mean, are there mom and pops that are required to comply, or what are? I mean, I'm sure it varies location by location, but maybe you could give us a little bit of an indication in terms of who it applies to, and then kind of that, the phasing aspect of it, right? How long do you have to comply? And you mentioned even some fines, so maybe you could talk a little more about that.
So there's like 14 cities and I think 2 counties and municipalities where this is now a requirement. Obviously it varies. I would say the most common scenario is that it's commercial, in some cases multifamily is included in that. Buildings that are over 50,000 square feet are required to benchmark and report that data annually. And typically the norm is when that requirement comes on the books through the city council, those building owners are given 2 years or so to comply for the first time. And there are all sorts of notices and work that the cities do on the back end to figure out, okay, well, who's actually responsible for complying? How do we reach them and tell them that this is a requirement? So I think that's the most common scenario. And then the extension of that as to how it's enforced is, of course, different in every city. In some cases, there are fines for every period that data is late, but we're not focusing on that so much as just helping people get the data that they need to comply. And for the most part, it is buildings over 50,000 square feet, sometimes 25,000, and the really gung-ho municipalities, but usually about 50.
What are the municipalities trying to achieve with, this legislation? Just really trying to reduce carbon emission and energy
Yeah, I mean, that's
consumption?
part of it. So a lot of it is lowering the information barrier and giving people solid information as they make an investment. So if you were in Boston 5 years ago before the requirement was in place and you were going to go lease a building or purchase a building, there was this huge gap in terms of the information that you had on the expected operating cost of the building as part of your investment that you didn't have. And so I think certainly carbon reduction is a goal as far as the disclosure requirements, but solving that deficiency in the market and lowering that information barrier, I think, was most key in why those ordinances started to get passed and why they're now gaining steam.
Okay, great, thank you. So Carlos, can you talk a little bit about Coca-Cola's energy management strategy and processes, and what kind of technologies have you found most helpful to you as an organization over time?
Yeah, sure. Well, for us, energy management means, align into our overall strategy more than 200 bottlers around the world and more than 800 manufacturing sites. And many of them are different stages of development, and they have different capabilities. So that's always a challenge. But we try to drive different areas. One is definitely energy efficiency, and what we want to make sure is that every manufacturing site has implemented all the basic stuff, and we are sure that that is happening. It stays in place. So a couple of years ago, we developed this program called the Top 10 Energy Efficiency Program. And it's comprised of 10 very basic activities, identify and repair air leaks, the insulation, lighting, and so on, very basic stuff. And now we are into the next top 10, which are more intermediate to advanced activities. But we actually track for each of these sites. We track what's the level of implementation of those activities. And to do that, we also implement some tools and guidance and develop some training and capability to support in that process. So that's part of the energy strategy. The other one, as I mentioned, is the clean energy. That is, is not as advanced as we would like to. And in that respect, we also rely on the capabilities of the very large bottlers that we have in some locations. And I would say that some of them are very proactive in the clean energy space, especially in terms of the technologies. I would say the wind and it's not renewable, but cogeneration, clean. We call that clean energy. So and basically they have gone to the path of the power purchase agreements that I mentioned before. Every time that there's the the balance, the way should I make the investment or can I leverage on third-party investment? Apparently, they have found a good route to go through the third party, assessing the risks, and that seems to be the way we have been progressing more and more the clean energy. We have also put in place some internal tools to try to overcome all these barriers that I mentioned before in terms of the information and how to be aware of incentives and legislation that can help put things into place. And in all these contexts, of course, data plays a very important role. We need data for everything. We have our for our targets. We have metrics, very well defined metrics, and we need to gather all that data. Yeah, that's basically how we handle energy management.
Great. So Mike, as an organization as large as you are and the footprint you have, you obviously have a lot of different suppliers, whether it be natural gas or power companies, utility companies, but maybe struggle to get information from them, over time. Just curious in terms of what you think could be done to kind of get the information you need, and is that something that the utility provider or natural resource provider, do you think could do on their own, or do you think it's really kind of a joint effort with others?
I mean, it's a good question. The investment in the smart grid technology that's out there, since 2009 through the Recovery Act, there's been about a little over $7.9 billion, which is 50-50 shared between industry and taxpayers. That's what's been invested in the smart grid since then. This is mainly across utility structures. 99 projects. So just keep it in the round numbers in your head. 99 projects, $7.9 billion. So what's interesting is that all of that investment's gone into hardware and infrastructure. The projects, if you look at the number of projects that have invested in data backbone, meaning standards, structures, transmission of data, there's maybe one.
Yeah.
So
and the data they could collect.
Absolutely. Well, they've got the data, right?
Right.
So they've got the infrastructure. We've got the infrastructure out there.
Yeah.
So there was an interesting survey that the IEEE folks did probably about a year ago. They surveyed 151 utilities that started making all this investment in smart grid. 53% of them said, yes, we have the data, but we do not know how to deliver it. And we don't really have a plan to deliver it, even though our customers tell us we should deliver it. So that's a pretty big number out of a $7.9 billion investment. More importantly, really only 17% of the utilities surveyed said that they had really, that was 17% had a plan to even begin delivery of it. So 53% weren't using it, and of the ones that were, or had it, 17% said, we're really not prepared at all to figure out how to do this. So, for us, looking at that, there's a gap. Obviously, there's a gap in data, and I didn't really realize until probably a little while back that there's over 100 different data standards for smart grid. I don't know if you guys know that in the room, right? So, we've seen that through I think it's the IEC. There's 100 different standards for smart grid data capture and delivery that's out there. So the standards exist. The money's been spent, and so something has to fill the void. So obviously, from our perspective, the pressure's on for these utilities to deliver. And so part of the, and maybe we look at it through a contracting process, that this is the defined delivery protocol that's required. We do this when we deliver airplanes. When I deliver airplanes, we have a defined delivery data standard for all the technical documentation and all the delivery systems that go with that package. When we buy trucks, it's the same way. When we buy energy, we don't do that.
Right.
So for us, it's a matter of how do we begin to incorporate that demand in the contracting
kind of
period.
working hand in hand,
Right.
so that you also get the data that you want. Right?
Well, I think it's the
do you
data.
think
I mean, I view it as the
you think
data
you
that
would
I
want all
own at the end of the
data?
day.
What?
It's the data that I believe we're entitled to.
Yeah. Right.
So I mean, we're paying for that at the
Yeah.
end of the day. So it's just a matter of how do we get that? How do we enforce that?
Okay. Interesting. Lots of data.
Lots of data.
So we've, for many of you may not be aware, but energy storage is really kind of emerging in the marketplace. And IHS has done some market research and said by 2022, 40 gigawatts of energy storage will actually be implemented in I believe that's a U.S. number. So Jay, what do you think some of the most competitive energy storage options are in the market today, and how do you think we'll be able to leverage that tool, and how do you think it will kind of evolve over time and change the market?
Yeah, I think the key is data. I think that's really important when it comes to the energy storage. Fitting that in as a resource into all the choices that companies are going to have. So it's key. That's going to be one key element. In terms of the technology, I think it's anybody's guess who is going to win, although money certainly helps. And we know that there's a couple big companies out there that are making a big bet on it. GE, of course, Tesla. Yeah. But I really think that software is going to be one of the major elements to make it a practical investment and resource for companies to use. So I think data and the software combining as to when you can make intelligent decisions about when it's best to use it. And of course, EnerNOC, we think DR and storage are better together, of course. Yeah. And so yeah, that's I think right now California and PJM are the best markets for it. Definitely utility scale is they're making a big investment in it. Yeah. So it's here to stay, and I think it's just not quite sure which technology is going to win yet.
Yeah, and we'll have to see how the regulatory markets support the implementation and the ability to actually receive compensation for the value you're adding to the system as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Great. Any questions from the audience? Right down here. And then we have another one. Okay, we'll get you in a minute, but we'll do this one here.
David Metcalf from Vedantics. I want to go to the title for the panel here and ask a question about carbon, because it hasn't really been much of a driver at all for investment over the last, it hasn't been. And I'm just interested to know, with the development of some of the markets like RGGI, with the Clean Power Plan coming in, thinking about the future as opposed to next year, but going beyond that, do you actually think that the carbon policy agenda is really going to start impacting investment in energy efficiency and renewables?
Anyone want to take a stab at it?
Well, let me just comment from our experience. As I say, I don't know, going forward, but what we've seen today with our, with our bottlers is that this continues to be a challenge, and many times it's until we set up a internal commitment, and many times is also driven by this kind, of external factors that are influencing. Still, with that in place, we have a lot of resistance from our operations, especially the independent bottlers, to progress the agenda, because again, it's one of those areas in which still many of the levers that at least in our industry we can use to reduce emissions. We have important financial constraints in terms of the return on investment and what I mentioned before on the value of sustainability. But definitely, the more we see that kind of external influencers, that also contributes to understand that value, and that drives the agenda.
Well, just a real comment. I mean, for us, it's really a two-step approach. We've really taken a lot of work in the last probably 5 years to look at our intensity. I mean, there's always an issue about intensity versus absolute. When you're dealing with jet aircraft, and there is not an alternative, right? I'm going to say an efficient alternative. You can force inefficient alternatives into the jet fuel, aviation fuel market, but you kind of circumvent the whole process at the end of the day. Why, so for us, the first focus is intensity, and just an unrelenting goal to reduce the intensity. And we kind of believe that if we have the lowest intensity per delivered piece, however you want to look at it, per ton mile, whatever the KPI is, by using that network, you do receive an overall carbon reduction right across the world. So by using our efficient network, we provide that. There's not really a way to take credit for that at the end of the day. So the first step is obviously the intensity goals you establish. I think once you establish the intensity goals, that makes you understand what your emissions profile looks like. And then when there's a price on carbon, which there ultimately probably will if we're going to live in a carbon constrained world, then you can start to look at how do you actually make fundamental absolute reductions, through investment or through, whatever other mechanism the market provides. So that's kind of been our approach right now. But the first is you can't wait. You need to understand what your emissions profiles look like, even if it's on an intensity level or an absolute basis. But that, again, starts with data.
Yeah, I think that once the Clean Power Plan gets out of all the legal wrangles that are going through it, I mean, some states are already putting together their plans and moving forward with it. A lot of them are going to fight it. It's in the courts already, but essentially it's almost essentially a carbon cap, right? And so there will be some regulations, and states are moving in that direction. So it is moving that way, but relative to the industrial sector, I mean, it's a financially driven decision. Some companies that are more internationally based are more receptive to it. They have different levels of hurdle rates for carbon than they do for energy, so to speak. But yeah, it's going to be interesting couple of years.
Mike, you mentioned about the utilities not being willing or able to release data. Do you think that is because they don't want the data released for what we're going to say about it, or they really can't release it? They don't know how to release it?
No, I think they the biggest benefit for them collecting this data was obviously they've seen big benefits in billing. Accurate, right? Able to bill for the energy that they're using. So that's the first and foremost. I don't think it's a problem of them not wanting to. I just don't think that they, again, 17% of the 151 utilities surveyed said we really don't have a plan or a strategy for how to release the data. Right? Yeah. So that's really it. It's defining, how to release the data. The standards are there. I mean, if you look at some of the standards that are out there, the standards for, the data are out there. It's just that they haven't made the investments in the backbone and the infrastructure on how to release that to, all the customers, right, at the end of the day, more so than just a very simplified billing format.
So they haven't prioritized it.
I think we'd have to ask them.
Yeah. Okay, great. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Just right in the center here. Can you raise your hand up again? Thanks.
Yes, Mike, this question is for you as well. Just curious, what is UPS's strategy towards fuel? Is it your biggest carbon footprint driver? Is it your biggest spend driver?
It is.
Okay, and just
yeah, 91% of our emissions are basically fuel related. Wow. If you look at our profile at the end of the day. So for us, and this goes back to a question you asked earlier about the bridge to renewables and alternatives. We operate one of the largest alternative fuel fleets. And in alternatives, there's two things, alternatives and renewables. Alternatives may not be renewable, but they're better than potentially petroleum. It might be a bridge. So we kind of consider it's better than the alternative at the end of the day. But for us, just to kind of give you an idea, this hurdle, which people talk about, there's not a single solution. So if we're sitting around the room waiting for, is solar going to win? Is wind going to win? Is geothermal going to win? Is CHP? Is, a fuel cell? Is what's going to win? There is not going to be one at scale. And so for us, we tend to adopt a variety of alternatives. We have the largest alternative fuel fleet that's probably rolling out there right now. So if you looked at our investments it's across the entire spectrum. So from natural gas vehicles, the investment in natural gas, we've got 4,400 vehicles using natural gas. People say, well, that's not the great. Well, it's a bridge, right? Because I can easily transition from natural gas to biomethane. right? It's because the infrastructure is in place. So for example, next year, we'll probably displace 50 million equivalent gallons of diesel with the natural gas fleet. If I can turn that into a biomethane stream where it makes sense, again, we start to lower that carbon intensity. No different than renewable diesel. Renewable diesel we've started with, which is a synthetic hydrocarbon. It's not a biodiesel, meaning this is a drop-in replacement for diesel. It's produced at about 5 different refineries around the world. For us, being able to commercialize that at scale, that's what we're trying to do, right? So we're trying to plug in every avenue that we can that makes sense. I mean, obviously, there's economics and all sorts of things that go with that. But for us, that's where we tend to have our focus, right? It's the focus, but the first focus is efficiency. So for every gallon we don't burn, that's the most efficient, way for us to deliver. So I hope I answered your question, but when it comes to fuels, I mean, we obviously have a very diversified portfolio. You can't pick a winner and a loser. We keep a lot of things rolling in a test lab, and then it allows us to deploy when that technology matures or becomes cost effective.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists. Hopefully you found this interesting. Thank you all.